The broadcast studio dropped into a paralyzed hush as Congresswoman Maxine Waters' remarks lingered in the atmosphere like a noxious cloud. You are merely a washed-up legislative hopeful, a failed Secret Service operative who was turned away by the American electorate on 3 separate occasions. You possess no standing to challenge anyone sitting in Congress. You stand as a humiliation to law enforcement professionals everywhere. Return to your podcasting cellar where you rightfully fit in. Dan Bongino remained entirely motionless. His demeanor stayed collected, almost peaceful, yet his gaze had turned icy and rigid like steel tempered in a furnace. He spoke softly. I have been insulted worse by far superior individuals. He went on, You have dedicated the past 15 minutes to assaulting my reputation, my background, and my duty to this nation. I arrived here this evening to address governmental responsibility and moral conduct within Congress. You have chosen to turn this into a personal attack. He pulled out a dense binder of paperwork. So let us make it personal then, Congresswoman. Because you have unlocked this gate, we shall discuss your history. And unlike your rhetoric, I arrived with documentation. The program, America Debates, anchored by seasoned reporter Patricia Morrison, was built as a fortress of polite argumentation with a straightforward structure. 2 conflicting perspectives, 1 unbiased arbiter, and 0 advertising breaks during the exchanges. Dan Bongino, a former Secret Service official and right-leaning pundit, had shown up ready and businesslike. Maxine Waters, the top member of the House Financial Services Committee, had walked in with a posse, sporting her trademark colorful fashion. The forum opened with an inquiry regarding institutional corruption. Bongino spoke broadly about legislators exploiting their stations for individual gain, referencing specific earmarks and equity trading without identifying targets. Waters replied not by engaging the logic, but by targeting Bongino individually, labeling him a fringe theorist and ridiculing his campaign defeats. She ramped up until unleashing the failed candidate slur that quieted the entire chamber. Bongino unclasped his binder. Let us begin with a subject you know intimately, the banking sector, specifically, One United Bank. He pressed her regarding her spouse, Sidney Williams, holding a seat on the board and her interference to set up a conference with the Treasury Secretary amidst the 2008 economic collapse. He pointed out that although federal auditors charged the bank with unsafe habits, it secured $12 million in TARP relief cash subsequent to her involvement. He referenced an electronic message from her grandson, her chief of staff, declaring One United is in jeopardy. He wrapped up, You orchestrated a sit-down for a financial institution where your husband sat on the board? That institution received $12 million in taxpayer funds. In my circle, we define what I just outlined as a classic example of a conflict of interest. Bongino shifted to a fresh pile of records concerning her daughter, Karen Waters. Starting in 2003, your election committee, Citizens for Waters, has disbursed to your daughter Karen and her firm Progressive Connections over $1.2 million. He broke down the slate mailer operation where hopefuls paid for backing, noting that Vice President Kamala Harris and Governor Gavin Newsom had contributed to this apparatus. You are fundamentally auctioning your approval, Congresswoman, and your offspring receives hundreds of thousands of dollars to manage it. He revealed a file from April 2025 demonstrating the FEC penalized her operation $68,000 for willfully taking surplus donations and distributing illicit cash payments. He confirmed a routine. This represents a decades-long habit of leveraging your seat and your operation to profit your kin, while dodging and occasionally violating ethics and campaign funding statutes. Bongino emphasized the disparity between her jurisdiction and her way of living. You stand for blue-collar neighborhoods, historically Black and Latino areas that have battled with indigence. He noted that she resides in a $6 million estate in Windsor Square, outside her zone, following redistricting, in a district that is merely 6% Black. Your voters have grates on their windows. You possess a security perimeter around your mansion. It appears your family became wealthy while their neighborhood became more destitute. When Waters asserted she struggled for social equity, Bongino quoted her 2018 address instructing followers to form a mob and push back on Trump administration staff in public venues. He also referenced her remarks during the Derek Chauvin hearing to become more confrontational, which the overseeing magistrate termed abhorrent and possibly grounds for a retrial. I was Secret Service, Congresswoman. I recognize what intimidation resembles. What you performed was agitation. Bongino introduced a 1998 missive Waters penned to Fidel Castro, petitioning him not to return Assata Shakur, a found guilty police slayer. You implored Castro not to send back a cop killer. You elected to align with her rather than with Trooper Werner Forster's relatives. Bongino recapped the stacks of proof spanning financial graft, moral breaches, provocation, disloyalty to law enforcement, and district abandonment. He finished, I campaigned for a seat 3 times and failed. I am a failed candidate, but you have triumphed at something far more terrible. You have succeeded at transforming public duty into individual gain. You have succeeded at dodging responsibility for decades. Waters tried to wave off the papers as a biased assault. Bongino pushed back. Arithmetic is not prejudiced, Congresswoman. These are FEC files. This is your public history. When Bongino declared, I am holding you answerable with records, with reality, this discussion is finished, Waters detached her lapel mic and exited, stating, I do not need to sit here and hear this. Left solo, Bongino spoke to the lens. I did not arrive here tonight to ruin anyone. Congresswoman Waters chose to make this interaction personal, so I answered with evidence. He went on. She departed rather than uphold her history. I would prefer to be a failed politician with honor than a triumphant one with 0. The clip went global, with banners reading, Bongino dismantles Waters. While Waters' team labeled it a partisan smear campaign, they did not refute the particular financial records or FEC submissions mentioned. The story ended that Waters had been unreachable for 34 years, until someone merely arrived with documentation. The silence that followed Congresswoman Waters' departure was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and pregnant with the weight of unsaid things that had suddenly been screamed into the national consciousness. Patricia Morrison, a veteran journalist who had covered war zones and presidential scandals, found herself momentarily paralyzed, staring at the empty chair where the ranking member had just sat. The red on-air light remained unblinkingly bright, a cruel reminder that the nation was watching this collapse in real time, and the producers in the control room were screaming instructions into her earpiece that she could barely process. Dan Bongino did not celebrate, nor did he smile in triumph. He simply organized his papers with the methodical precision of a man who had treated this debate not as a television appearance, but as a crime scene investigation. He tapped the edge of the thick folder against the glass table, the sound echoing like a gavel in the quiet studio, before sliding the documents toward the center of the desk, as if submitting them into evidence for the jury of the American public. I believe, Bongino said, breaking the silence with a voice that was level and devoid of adrenaline, that the empty chair speaks louder than any defense she could have offered regarding these financial transfers. Morrison finally regained her composure, her instincts kicking in as she turned to the camera to address the millions of viewers who were undoubtedly freezing their screens and texting their families. Ladies and gentlemen, it appears that Congresswoman Waters has chosen to discontinue her participation in this evening's forum, she stated, her voice tight but professional, trying to salvage the wreckage of the broadcast. However, the format of America Debates allows for the remaining guest to utilize the time, provided the discourse remains on the agreed-upon topic of government ethics and accountability. She turned back to Bongino, her eyes glancing at the stack of papers he had labeled the receipts, realizing that the segment had shifted from a debate into a deposition. Mr. Bongino, you have made serious allegations regarding banking irregularities and campaign finance violations. And since the Congresswoman is not here to refute them, the burden of proof is exceptionally high. Bongino nodded slowly, acknowledging the gravity of the situation, and replied, Patricia, I didn't write these documents. The Federal Election Commission and her own signature did. So if there is a refutation, it must be against the math itself. In the backstage corridors, the scene was chaotic, resembling the evacuation of a sinking vessel, as Waters' entourage swept through the hallway in a phalanx of agitated aides and security personnel. The Congresswoman moved with furious momentum, her previous confidence replaced by a visceral indignation, barking orders at a terrified press secretary to get the car and shut down any approaching cameras. I will not be ambushed by right-wing propaganda in a studio that promised a fair conversation, she was heard saying, her voice echoing off the concrete walls of the loading dock, though the specific rebuttal to the banking allegations remained notably absent. Her chief of staff was already on the phone, screaming at the network executives, threatening access revocation and demanding a retraction before the segment had even finished airing. Yet as they burst through the exit doors into the cool evening air of Washington, D.C., the notifications on their phones were already lighting up the dark interior of the waiting SUV like fireflies. The clip of the One United confrontation had already been viewed 2 million times in 10 minutes, and the hashtag Bongino Receipts was trending higher than the president's scheduled address. Back inside the studio, the atmosphere had shifted from shock to a clinical dissection of the evidence, as Morrison realized she had no choice but to examine the papers Bongino had presented. You mentioned the campaign payments to her daughter, Morrison asked, picking up a spreadsheet that detailed years of disbursements. But is this not technically legal under the current loose framework of campaign finance laws? Bongino leaned forward, his demeanor shifting from prosecutor to teacher, explaining that legality does not equate to ethical propriety or immunity from public criticism. Patricia, we are looking at a system where a politician raises money from corporate interests and then funnels that money directly into the bank account of an immediate family member for consulting fees that far exceed market rates, he explained, pointing to a specific line item from 2020. If a CEO did this with shareholder money, they would be removed by the board and investigated by the SEC for self-dealing. Yet we allow members of Congress to treat their campaign chests like family trust funds. He paused, letting the viewers digest the numbers, adding, the loophole makes it legal, but the concealment makes it corrupt, and the voters deserve to know that their donations are becoming her daughter's salary. The broadcast ended not with a traditional sign-off, but with a lingering shot of the 2 stacks of paper, one for the bank scandal, one for the campaign funds, sitting alone on the glass desk. As the cameras cut, the internet was already doing the work that mainstream investigative journalists had neglected for decades, with thousands of users downloading the publicly available FEC filings to verify Bongino's claims. By the next morning, the narrative had escaped the control of the spin doctors. It was no longer about a debate walkout, but about a sudden, collective realization of the scale of wealth transfer occurring in plain sight. Major news networks, initially hesitant to cover the confrontation for fear of appearing biased, were forced to address the story because the engagement numbers were undeniable. A somber anchor on a rival network opened their morning show with a reluctant admission. While the delivery was confrontational, independent fact-checkers have verified that the financial figures cited by Bongino regarding the Citizens for Waters Committee are accurate to the penny. 3 days later, the impact of the receipts incident began to materialize in the district that Waters had represented for over 3 decades. A town hall meeting, originally scheduled to discuss a new infrastructure project, transformed into a standing-room-only referendum on the Congresswoman's financial history. The constituents, usually reliable supporters who viewed her as a champion against systemic injustice, stood in long lines wrapping around the community center, many holding printouts of the slate mailer payments. The atmosphere was not hostile in a violent sense, but it possessed a cold, demanding clarity that is far more dangerous to a career politician than simple anger. When a junior staffer attempted to take the stage to announce that the Congresswoman would be joining via video link due to security concerns, a low rumble of dissatisfaction vibrated through the floorboards. The people did not want a remote lecture. They wanted to know why the bank that foreclosed on their neighbor's home had received a bailout after a meeting set up by their representative. When Waters finally appeared on the large projection screen, sitting in her well-appointed home office, the disconnect between her surroundings and the peeling paint of the community center was visually jarring. She began her address with the familiar rhetoric of fighting for the marginalized and resisting the attacks of political enemies, expecting the usual applause lines to land. They are trying to silence a strong voice because they cannot handle the truth of our movement, she declared, her voice amplified through the distortion of the sound system. However, instead of cheers, a young woman near the front stood up and approached the microphone stand, holding a microphone that felt heavy with the weight of the moment. "Congresswoman, we respect your history," the constituent said, her voice shaking slightly but gaining strength. "But Mr. Bongino showed us that your family has made millions from the campaign, while our schools don't have air conditioning." The room fell silent, waiting for an answer that wasn't a slogan. Waters stiffened on the screen, her eyes narrowing as she realized that the right-wing hit job defense was not penetrating the reality of her own voters' economic struggles. "That man is a liar who doesn't care about this community," Waters snapped back, her tone sharp and defensive. "And those payments were for legitimate campaign services that help us win elections to fight for you." The crowd murmured, unsatisfied, because they knew that legitimate services rarely cost $1 million in a district where the median income struggled to hit $40,000. Another man stood up, a small business owner who had lost his shop during the lockdowns, and asked, "If the bank was failing and hurting our community, why did you help get them money instead of helping us get loans?" The questions were coming in waves now, a dam breaking after 30 years of holding back the water. Back in his studio, Bongino watched the live stream of the town hall with a somber expression, understanding that he had lit a fuse that was now burning toward a powder keg of populist frustration. He turned to his producer and said quietly, "This is what happens when you treat a public office as a private business. Eventually, the customers ask to see the books." He began recording his podcast, speaking directly to the audience not with arrogance, but with a warning about the bipartisan nature of the problem. "What we saw in that debate wasn't just about Maxine Waters," he told his listeners, leaning into the microphone. "It was about a permanent political class that believes they are exempt from the standards of the people they govern." He pulled up another document, one he hadn't used in the debate. showing similar patterns from politicians on the other side of the aisle. If we are going to clean this up, we have to be willing to look at the receipts for everyone, friend or foe, because corruption has no political party. The fallout continued to spiral as the House Ethics Committee, usually a dormant body that preferred to sweep issues under the rug, announced a preliminary review of the new information brought to light. It was a face-saving measure, a bureaucratic attempt to look busy while hoping the news cycle would move on, but the genie was out of the bottle. Investigative journalists, sensing blood in the water and competing for the clicks that the story was generating, began digging into the One United Bank records with renewed vigor. They found emails that had been previously overlooked, communications that showed a direct line between the donations to the Congresswoman's campaign and the access granted to banking executives. The story shifted from a dramatic TV moment to a sustained legal headache, with subpoenas being discussed in hushed tones around Capitol Hill. Waters attempted a counteroffensive, launching a media tour on friendly networks to reframe the narrative as an attack on her legacy and her demographic. She sat for softball interviews where she was allowed to monologue without interruption, characterizing the scrutiny as a dangerous precedent that would discourage public service. "If they can do this to me, after all I have sacrificed," she told a sympathetic host on a Sunday morning talk show, "then no one is safe from these character assassins who weaponize administrative paperwork." Yet, the strategy was failing because the weapon was not innuendo or rumor, but the cold, hard arithmetic of her own financial disclosures. For every emotional appeal she made, the internet responded with a screenshot of the ledger, a meme format that became the ultimate rebuttal to her rhetoric. The climax of this political winter arrived when the FEC issued a statement clarifying the fines mentioned by Bongino, confirming that while the fines were paid, the underlying practices of family enrichment were technically legal but highly irregular. This technicality, meant to exonerate her, actually damned her further in the court of public opinion, because it highlighted that the system itself was broken. The Bongino rule began to enter the lexicon of political commentary, referring to the strategy of bypassing ideological arguments to focus entirely on financial forensics. Candidates across the country, seeing the effectiveness of the tactic, began hiring forensic accountants instead of opposition researchers, terrifying incumbents in both parties. The debate had inadvertently launched a new era of weaponized transparency. 6 months later, the political landscape had subtly but permanently shifted, leaving scars on the establishment that would not heal. Dan Bongino sat in his studio looking at a framed photo of the empty chair from that night, a symbol of the moment the bluff was called. He didn't run for office again. He realized his power was greater as the man holding the flashlight than the man holding the gavel. Maxine Waters remained in Congress, her district gerrymandered enough to secure her seat, but her influence was diminished. Her committee hearings now plagued by constant inquiries about her conflicts of interest. She had survived the battle, but she had lost the war for her reputation, forever tagged with the asterisk of the receipts. The final scene of this saga played out not on television, but in a quiet hallway of the Rayburn House office building. Bongino, in D.C. for a hearing, crossed paths with Waters' chief of staff, the grandson whose emails had been read aloud to the nation. They stopped for a brief moment, the tension thick enough to choke on, two men on opposite sides of a cultural chasm. The aide looked at Bongino with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect, knowing that the failed politician had done what no Speaker of the House could do. Bongino simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement that the game had changed, and walked past him. As he exited the building, the sun was setting over the Capitol dome, casting long shadows that looked like bars across the white stone. a reminder that in the end, the truth is the only thing that doesn't need a campaign fund to survive. The digital revolution that followed the broadcast was not televised in the traditional sense, but rather streamed, downloaded, and dissected across a million glowing screens in the quiet corners of the American heartland. The very basement that Congresswoman Waters had used as a pejorative to dismiss Dan Bongino became the operational headquarters for a new, decentralized army of citizen auditors who took her insult as a badge of honor. These were not the chaotic trolls of social media legend, but accountants, paralegals, retired auditors, and stay-at-home parents who realized that the Federal Election Commission database was a public domain library waiting to be read. They formed loose coalitions on encrypted messaging apps, organizing themselves by district and committee assignment, treating the financial disclosures of the ruling class like pieces of a massive, intentionally scrambled puzzle. Within weeks, the hashtag #TheAudit had morphed from a slogan into a functional open-source intelligence operation, stripping away the veneer of complexity that politicians used to hide their self-dealing. Washington, D.C., a city built on the twin pillars of prestige and secrecy, reacted to this sudden transparency with the frantic, uncoordinated movements of a hive that had been kicked over. The established lobbying firms, which had operated for decades on the gentleman's agreement that certain financial intricacies were off-limits for public discussion, found their phones ringing with panicked clients, demanding to know if their donations were being scrutinized. A palpable paranoia settled over the Capitol Hill Club and the upscale steakhouses of K Street, where power brokers usually conducted business with impunity, as they began to suspect that every waiter or valet might be recording the license plates of their luxury vehicles. The fear was not of legal prosecution, which they could usually navigate with high-priced counsel, but of the Bongino effect, the sudden viral exposure of hypocrisy that stripped them of their moral authority before they could even issue a press release. It was a terrifying inversion of the power dynamic, where the surveilled populace had suddenly turned the cameras back on the surveillance state, and the state found itself blinking in the harsh light. In response to this rising tide of scrutiny, a predictable defensive mechanism began to whir into motion within the halls of Congress, disguised as a bipartisan effort to restore civility to public discourse. A coalition of senior legislators, including several who had been quietly flagged by the online auditors for suspicious stock trades, drafted a piece of legislation tentatively titled the Dignity in Public Service Act. The bill was framed with soaring rhetoric about protecting public servants from digital harassment and coordinated disinformation campaigns, but the fine print revealed a disturbing attempt to restrict access to real-time financial data. They argued that the weaponization of administrative filings posed a national security risk, suggesting that foreign adversaries could use the data to compromise American leaders, a narrative that was quickly amplified by friendly legacy media outlets. It was a classic Washington maneuver, attempting to criminalize the observation of corruption rather than the corruption itself, all while wrapping the censorship in the flag of patriotism. Dan Bongino, watching this legislative counterattack from his studio, recognized the play immediately and utilized his platform to dismantle the bill with the same surgical precision he had used on the debate stage. He dedicated an entire week of programming to reading the text of the bill line by line, translating the legalese into plain English for his audience, explaining how protecting privacy actually meant hiding the receipts. He posed a simple question that resonated across the political spectrum. If they are working for you, why are they afraid of you seeing the bill? The pressure campaign that ensued was unprecedented, with congressional switchboards crashing under the volume of calls from constituents who, for the first time in years, understood exactly how the sausage was being made and refused to eat it. The Dignity Bill died in committee, not because of a whip count or a backroom deal, but because the sheer weight of public awareness crushed it before it could ever reach the floor. Meanwhile, the cultural ripple effects of the Waters-Bongino confrontation began to reshape the media landscape, forcing veteran journalists to confront the obsolescence of their own access-based business model. Patricia Morrison, the host who had presided over the fateful debate, found herself in a professional existential crisis, realizing that her role as a gatekeeper of information had been rendered irrelevant by a guy with a folder of PDFs. She pushed her network executives to pivot, arguing that if they didn't start covering the financial corruption stories with the same aggression as the independent creators, they would lose their audience entirely to the podcast ecosystem. The network attempted a clumsy rebrand, launching a segment called The Ledger, but it lacked the authenticity and the bite of the grassroots movement, feeling more like damage control than genuine investigative journalism. They were trying to ride a wave that they had spent decades trying to suppress, and the audience, now educated on the nuances of controlled opposition, tuned out in record numbers. The movement soon claimed its first casualty on the other side of the aisle, proving Bongino's thesis that corruption was not a partisan issue, but a systemic condition of the permanent political class. A powerful Republican senator, a man who had campaigned for years on fiscal conservatism and draining the swamp, was exposed by the audit community for funneling campaign donations into a real estate holding company owned by his son-in-law. The revelation did not come from the New York Times or the Washington Post, but from a Substack article written by a 22-year-old economics student in Ohio who had simply cross-referenced property tax records with FEC disbursements. When the story broke, the senator expected the usual partisan defense, that this was a liberal smear job, but he was shocked to find that his own base, radicalized by the receipts standard, turned on him with ferocious speed. There was no circling of the wagons. Instead, the conservative ecosystem devoured him, demanding his resignation with the same intensity they had directed at Maxine Waters, proving that the new standard of integrity was absolute. As the midterm elections approached, the political atmosphere was charged with a volatile energy that defied traditional polling models, which were still asking voters about ideology rather than accountability. A new crop of candidates began to emerge, dubbing themselves the auditors, individuals who ran not on vague promises of hope and change, but on specific pledges to open the books and simplify the federal ledger. These candidates, often political novices ranging from small business owners to forensic accountants, carried binders to their debates instead of prepared speeches, challenging incumbents to explain specific line items in real time. The visual of the thick folder became a symbol of the cycle, a prop that signaled to the audience that the candidate was armed with facts rather than platitudes. In district after district, incumbents who had coasted for decades on name recognition found themselves sweating under the studio lights, unable to explain why their net worth had tripled on a government salary. One particular race in a swing district became the microcosm of this national shift, pitting a 30-year incumbent against a young, soft-spoken woman who had formerly worked as a fraud investigator for an insurance company. The incumbent attempted to run a traditional campaign of negative attack ads and ribbon-cutting ceremonies, dismissing his opponent as inexperienced and obsessed with minutiae. However, during their only televised debate, the challenger did not attack his character. She simply projected a graph of his voting record alongside a graph of his top donors' stock performance, showing a correlation that was mathematically impossible to dismiss as coincidence. She looked into the camera and said, "He isn't voting for your jobs, he is voting for his portfolio." A line that was clipped and shared more times than any presidential address that year. On election night, she won by 12 points, a landslide that sent a shockwave through the party leadership of both sides, signaling that the era of safe seats was officially over. The aftermath of the election saw a transformation in the daily operations of the Capitol, where the fear of the receipts changed behavior more effectively than any ethics law ever could. Committee hearings, once grandstanding opportunities for sound bites, became tedious, meticulous affairs where members were terrified to advocate for special interests, for fear of immediate viral fact-checking. The luxury lunch spots in D.C. saw a decline in revenue as lobbyists and members stopped meeting in public, driven underground by the omnipresent threat of the citizen journalist with a smartphone. It was a grim, paranoid existence for the corrupt, a panopticon of the people, where the walls had eyes and the ledgers had readers. The fun had gone out of the grift. The easy money was now dangerous money, and many senior members announced their sudden retirements to spend more time with family, fleeing the burning building before the structural beams gave way. Dan Bongino, observing this transformation from his studio in Florida, understood that the victory was fragile and required constant vigilance to maintain. He shifted his content strategy away from the daily news cycle and toward education, creating a Citizens Academy series that taught his millions of listeners how to file Freedom of Information Act requests, how to read 990 tax forms, and how to track legislative earmarks. He was building an infrastructure of accountability that would outlast his own career, seeding the population with the skills necessary to keep the government in check long after he hung up his headphones. He often remarked on air that freedom is not a state of being, but an active discipline, encouraging his audience to view their citizenship as a job rather than a status. The Bongino rule, that if you cannot show the math, you cannot hold the seat, had become the new unspoken amendment to the Constitution. Congresswoman Waters, while diminished, remained a defiant figure in the House, though her influence was now contained within the rigid boundaries of her gerrymandered district. She became a cautionary tale for the younger generation of progressives who viewed her not as an icon of the movement, but as a liability who represented the excesses of the old guard. They treated her with a polite, distant respect, but they kept their financial records pristine, terrified of becoming the next target of the audit. The One United scandal hung over her legacy like a lead weight, a permanent footnote in every article written about her, ensuring that no matter what legislation she passed, the conversation would always circle back to the bank. She had kept her seat, but she had lost her narrative, trapped in a purgatory where she was in power but out of control. As the years passed, the receipts debate was taught in political science classes not as a moment of partisan conflict, but as the tipping point of the information age's impact on representative democracy. Professors would show the clip of the walkout to freshman students, explaining how the monopoly on information was broken by a single, well-prepared individual who refused to accept the premise of authority without evidence. The event was analyzed as the death knell of the soundbite era and the birth of the data era, where rhetoric without citation was viewed with inherent suspicion. The students, raised in a world where transparency was the baseline expectation, often laughed at the arrogance of the politicians in the video, unable to comprehend a time when leaders thought they could simply command respect without earning it through the ledger. Ultimately, the story was not about Dan Bongino or Maxine Waters, but about the maturation of the American electorate, a coming-of-age moment where the public realized that the government was not a parent to be obeyed, but an employee to be audited. The fear that had once silenced the studio audience had been replaced by a cold, unwavering demand for competence and honesty. The poison gas of Waters' insults had dissipated, blown away by the fresh air of transparency, leaving behind a clearer, harder landscape where there were no shadows left to hide in. The Republic had survived, scarred and cynical, but awake for the first time in decades, watching the books with unblinking eyes. And in the basement of the Capitol, in the deep archives where the paper records were stored, the dust settled on the files, no longer forgotten, but waiting for the next hand to pull them into the light. The evolution of the audit movement did not stop at the water's edge of campaign finance, but rather, like a relentless tide, it began to erode the foundations of the unelected bureaucracy that constituted the true machinery of the state. The citizen auditors, now seasoned by months of scouring FEC filings, turned their forensic gaze toward the labyrinthine procurement contracts of the Department of Defense and the Department of Education, searching for the friction points where tax dollars transformed into private profit. They discovered a subterranean world of no-bid contracts and consulting fees that made the transgressions of Maxine Waters look like petty theft in comparison to the industrial-scale looting being conducted by the administrative state. Dan Bongino, acting as the de facto commander-in-chief of this decentralized army, began to broadcast deep-dive segments that resembled graduate-level seminars on forensic accounting, rather than political commentary, dissecting the omnibus spending bills that Congress passed without reading. He famously held up a 3,000-page document during a broadcast, dropping it onto his desk with a thud that shook the microphone stand, and declared, "This isn't a budget, it is a ransom note, and you are the hostage paying for your own captivity." The establishment, realizing that the Dignity Bill had failed to stem the bleeding, shifted their strategy from legislative censorship to technocratic suffocation, utilizing the complexity of the financial system as a weapon against the populists. The Treasury Department, working in tandem with the Federal Reserve, announced a pilot program for a central bank digital currency, CBDC, framed publicly as a modernization effort to streamline benefits and protect the consumer from the volatility of the market. However, the fine print of the white paper, buried under hundreds of pages of academic jargon, contained provisions for programmable money that could be restricted based on the carbon footprint or social compliance of the spender. It was a silent coup, an attempt to bypass the messy business of democracy entirely by gaining direct control over the purchasing power of the citizenry, effectively turning the entire economy into a company store. Bongino recognized the existential nature of this threat immediately, understanding that if the government controlled the ledger, the receipts would simply be deleted before they could ever be read. The battleground for this new conflict was not a television studio, but the cavernous, marble-walled hearing room of the Senate Banking Committee, where the architects of the CBDC were scheduled to testify. The atmosphere was sterile and cold, a stark contrast to the heated passion of the town halls, as the technocrats in their gray suits prepared to explain why the surrender of financial privacy was necessary for national security. They spoke in a language of liquidity ratios and interoperability, designed to induce a glaze over the eyes of the public and the senators alike, hoping to bore the opposition into submission. But this time, the senators on the panel were not operating on blind faith. They were armed with questions crowdsourced from the Citizens Academy, technical inquiries that pierced through the jargon like a hot knife through butter. A junior senator from Kentucky, holding a tablet streaming live analysis from the audit community, interrupted the Federal Reserve Vice Chair mid-sentence to ask about line 402 of the code which authorized retroactive wallet freezing. The Vice Chair, a man accustomed to the deferential treatment of the cocktail circuit, stammered for a moment, his composure cracking as he realized the room understood the implications of the technology better than he did. "Senator, those are merely emergency protocols for preventing money laundering," he replied, his voice lacking the conviction it usually carried in the faculty lounge, and would only be used in extreme cases of domestic terrorism. The room went silent, The phrase domestic terrorism hanging in the air, a term that had been expanded in recent years to include parents at school board meetings and religious activists. The senator leaned into the microphone, his eyes locked on the bureaucrat, and read a statement from the agency's own internal emails, which had been leaked by a whistleblower inspired by the Bongino movement. According to this email from your chief of strategy, the senator read slowly, the goal of the programmable feature is to incentivize correct behavioral patterns in the populace. Tell me, sir, which behaviors are you planning to correct? Back in his studio, watching the hearing unfold, Bongino saw the mask slip, revealing the authoritarian impulse that had been hiding behind the mask of convenience and safety for decades. He took to the airwaves that night with a ferocity that surpassed the initial confrontation with Waters, warning his audience that the receipts were no longer just about past corruption, but about preventing a future where corruption was automated. They don't want to hide the money anymore, he told his listeners, his voice low and urgent. They want to make it so that your money isn't yours, unless you do exactly what they say. The segment went viral globally, translated into a dozen languages, sparking a run on physical cash and decentralized assets as people rushed to secure their wealth outside the digital panopticon. The bank run was not a panic of insolvency, but a panic of liberty, a mass withdrawal of consent from a system that had revealed its intention to act as a master rather than a servant. The political fallout was catastrophic for the proponents of the digital currency, who found themselves fighting a war on two fronts: the technical exposure of their code and the moral rejection of their philosophy. The auditors began to dig into the personal investments of the regulatory officials pushing the new currency, discovering that many of them held substantial pre-IPO stakes in the private contracting firms building the infrastructure. It was the same old song of self-enrichment, but played on a digital instrument, and the public, now trained to hear the dissonance, revolted with a unified voice that cut across party lines. State legislatures, sensing the mood of the electorate, began passing financial sovereignty laws, effectively banning the use of the federal digital currency within their borders and mandating the acceptance of physical cash. The federal government found itself in a standoff with its own component states, a constitutional crisis precipitated by the simple act of reading the terms of service. As the months dragged on, the Bongino rule began to metastasize into the corporate world, where shareholders started demanding the same level of granular transparency from Fortune 500 CEOs that voters demanded from Congress. The era of ESG, environmental, social, and governance investing, which had been used as a vehicle to push political agendas through corporate boardrooms, collapsed under the weight of forensic audits that revealed massive inefficiencies and hypocrisy. Companies that had spent millions on glossy diversity brochures while using slave labor in their supply chains were exposed, their stock prices tumbling as the market repriced the risk of dishonesty. The audit movement had become a universal solvent, dissolving the glue of lies that held together the institutions of the post-war order, leaving only the hard reality of the balance sheet. It was a painful, chaotic correction, a great sobering after decades of drunken spending and moral hazard, but it was necessary for the survival of the host. In the midst of this societal restructuring, a quiet meeting took place in a diner outside of Baltimore, far away from the cameras and the microphones of the Capitol. Dan Bongino sat across from a former high-ranking official of the FBI, a man who had been pushed out during the purges for refusing to sign off on politically motivated warrants. They didn't speak of grand theories or political philosophy. They spoke of logistics, of how to protect the whistleblowers who were now coming forward in droves, clutching hard drives full of evidence. "The dam has broken, Dan," the former agent said, dipping a piece of toast into his coffee. "They can't plug the leaks anymore because the ship is made of holes." Bongino nodded, looking out the window at the passing traffic, realizing that the movement he had sparked was no longer under his control, nor anyone else's. It was a force of nature now, a wildfire clearing the underbrush of a century of corruption, and all he could do was try to guide the wind. The climax of this era arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet resignation of the Speaker of the House, a titan of the establishment who had ruled the chamber with an iron fist for 20 years. Facing a revolt from his own caucus and a primary challenge from a receipts candidate who had memorized the Speaker's voting record better than the Speaker himself, he announced he would not seek re-election. His farewell speech was a bitter, rambling defense of deal-making and compromise, bemoaning the loss of the old ways where leaders could govern without the constant harassment of the public. As he walked away from the podium, the chamber was silent, the applause polite but sparse, marking the end of the era of the professional politician. The new class, taking their seats, did not come to make deals. They came to audit the books, and they carried their mandates like subpoenas. Ultimately, the nation settled into a new equilibrium, one defined by a permanent, low-level tension between the governors and the governed. A healthy distrust that acted as the immune system of the republic. The One United scandal and the CBDC fight were remembered as the opening skirmishes of the Transparency Wars, a period where the American people relearned the muscular responsibilities of citizenship. Dan Bongino eventually retired from the microphone, his voice raspy from years of warning, retiring to a quiet life, content in the knowledge that he had taught a generation how to read the fine print. But every now and then, when a politician stood up to make a promise that sounded too good to be true, a collective murmur would rise from the crowd. A question asked not with anger, but with the cold, steely expectation of an auditor, "Show us the receipts." And in that simple, terrifying demand, the spirit of the Republic was reborn, vigilant, armed with the math, and unwilling to ever close its eyes again.